The most common contractual mistakes, episode 9, not addressing taxation. Part of the series, Global Business Law in 20 Minutes with Federico Vasoli. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is attorney Mac Pierre-Louis. I'm a lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And I'm Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And I'm Federico Vasoli, managing partner of the MTV Global with offices in Singapore, Vietnam, and Malta.
All right. We are with Federico today to discuss another part of his long-running series, Common Contractual Mistakes. As you all know, Federico is a business lawyer who is based in multiple countries, Italy, Malta, Singapore, Vietnam. And so he's a world-class guy who gives us a lot of meat to digest whenever we want to talk business. So he's a business guy, a business guru. We're glad to have him back. And so today's topic is going to be on not addressing taxation and how that can create a big problem whenever you are drafting contracts, and usually why you need a good business lawyer to kind of help you out. And so, Federico, we were talking before the show a little bit about different examples of when situations come up where people make big mistakes by not correctly addressing taxation issues in their contractual agreements. Can you kind of lay the foundation and give folks a little bit of an idea of what you want to talk about today? Also, remember, like I said, for some of us who are not business lawyers, you have to, give it to us as simple as possible, because that will only make us better by educating us. Please.
Thank you, Mac. I'll try my best to match your very generous introduction and kind words. You're doing a fantastic job with this, but enough with the bilateral congratulations. So in layterms words, taxation is one of the ultimate powers of the state. So you owe money to the state. If you make an income, even if you do not make a profit, sometimes income is taxed before you make a profit. It is the case, for instance, here in Italy, where I'm recording this episode this time. I'm not in Malta, nor am I in Singapore, nor am I in Vietnam for once. I'm temporarily here. But anyway, simple explanation. There are various taxation systems. In general, most countries, like Italy, I assume Poland, but do correct me if I'm wrong, Natalia, they tax you on your worldwide income if you are a resident in that country, in Poland, in Italy, elsewhere. And when I say you, I mean both you as a natural person and you as a company or whatever other legal entity that has a presence, a residency in that jurisdiction. There are other countries like the US that impose taxation on so-called US persons, so normally citizens or green card holders, not necessarily living in the US. So you are American, you are a US citizen, you live in Poland, you live in Vietnam. In theory, the US will tax you. Then you have to file your tax returns. There are, of course, exceptions. I'm not an American lawyer. I'm not an American tax lawyer, but I know that there are some thresholds, some exceptions, etc., through which you don't effectively get taxed, but at least you have to file some returns. And then there are some other countries, like Singapore, for instance, where you are only taxed, and again, you can be you natural person or you legal entity, association, whatever. You are taxed on the income that you make in that jurisdiction or that you remit to that jurisdiction. You may have to still fill your returns or to file your returns on incomes that you make outside of that jurisdiction, but you don't have to pay taxes on that. So to give you an example, you have a company in Singapore. The company in Singapore trades both in Singapore and outside of Singapore. If you can prove that the money that you made outside of Singapore was not generated by an activity there, for instance, your director is physically in Singapore, the management team is in Singapore, etc., and you have clients in Mexico, that is money that is most likely made in Singapore. But if you can demonstrate that you made money, it's easier if you're a natural person. You have multiple sources of income. For instance, you have a flat in, I don't know, in Canada. You rent it out and you get your rent in Canada. And you live in Singapore. In theory, Singapore will not tax you. They couldn't care less. You must declare it. You most likely have to pay taxes in Canada, in this example, but you're not going to be taxed in Singapore. So these are the three general scenarios, the three general systems. The last one being, of course, the most advantageous in most cases, because you're only taxed locally on the money that you either make there or that you remit. So in the case of the rental, you rent your flat out abroad, you bring that money to your bank account in Singapore, in Malta, which is also similar in terms of system, and you get taxed in Singapore and Malta, wherever. So this is the first layer that I wanted to give out to you.
Thank you for that. And let me ask you also about it. And have you ever advised on this sort of circumstances, advising people where to ground the business based on taxation? And what I mean by that is both direct taxes and indirect taxes. And also how you see that certain types of activity would be better if they are founded or run in certain jurisdictions exactly because of taxation. What's your view on that?
My view is that long are the days when tax planning is the pivotal element for the setting up of a business. Now, it is very true that at the time of recording this episode, you have companies, worldwide multinational companies, especially tech giants, that do minimize their taxes. And we all know the G20 in Rome just happened. And that was one of the topics that were discussed by President Biden and the other world leaders. But reality is that in 2021, as my business partner in Singapore loves to say, it is the strength of the truth. So where do you effectively do your business? Where can you prove that you make your money? We're not in the 80s anymore, where business people could stash cash in different parts of the world in banks that held secrecy over bank account holders, etc. With organizations like the OECD and others, it is more and more difficult to hide. And I frankly don't think it is right to hide. It is simply fair that if you operate in a certain jurisdiction, you follow those rules and you pay taxes according to those rules. If you don't like those rules, if you don't like those taxes, go somewhere else. The title of today's episode is not addressing taxation. Sometimes it is overly addressed, especially for a guy like me, a lawyer like me that operates in sort of tax-friendly jurisdictions like Singapore and Malta, even though, mind you, they're whitelisted. Well, Malta has recently been grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force, but that's a different story. So what I'm saying is both countries exchange information. They're not tax havens. Still, sometimes it's quite rare, but there are some people that are perhaps not as educated or as familiar as others with how taxes work. And sometimes they approach me and say, well, I run my business in, I don't know, in Spain, in Poland, in the US, but I want to pay taxes in Singapore because they're lower than in Spain, Poland, or the US. It doesn't work like that. If you don't like the taxation system in Spain, for instance, and you prefer the one in Singapore, then set up a structure in Singapore. And that entails so many other legal aspects. It's not just about doing what some lawyers call forum shopping. That is, you choose jurisdiction A, jurisdiction B, because jurisdiction A is more convenient than jurisdiction B. No. If you want to set up a company, for instance, in Singapore or in Malta, you need to follow company law, the basic norms of company law, employment law regulations. banking regulations. It's not that easy. You don't just set up a company in Malta because you want to pay taxes in Malta, which are lower than in Italy. You have to set up a company, have a director, employ the right people, have local economic substance, have a business which is legitimate and that follows the rules. Open a bank account, and then again, that is a big stumbling block. I keep on mentioning bank accounts because banks are being pretty nitpicky recently. So they want to see how you trade, who you are, what references you can show, etc., etc. So it's not as immediate as it can sound. And sometimes business people lose their focus and they focus too much on the tax rates instead of doing business and instead of making a real income, which is essentially the whole point of doing business. So yes, not addressing or over-addressing taxation is something that involves both natural persons that move from one place to the other, as well as companies. And for natural persons, COVID-19 has been an extra element of another difficulty represented. It's another aspect of difficulties that increase the level of problems that this pandemic has caused to everybody. I can give you some examples, but I believe you may have some questions now.
You know, that was actually my question. Can you give us an example of how this has worked?
I can give you a very concrete example. We have a client in Singapore. There is a natural person. We advise him and his family on their business in Singapore. They're not Singaporeans and they're not permanent residents. Now, the key element for taxation, I may have not said that in the introduction, is residency, is where you live. Even though the two concepts may not overlap 100%. Anyway, this person is not a Singaporean resident and not a permanent resident of Singapore, but he is a resident of Singapore through an employment pass. That is, he has his own business and he's employed in Singapore by his own business. So he's both employer and employee at the same time. Due to COVID, he had to go back to his home country, which is not exactly tax friendly. And again, due to COVID, Singapore introduced harsh restriction norms, whereby EP holders, who are the majority of residents of Singapore, if you take citizens aside, so permanent residents are sort of an exception. The majority of residents of Singapore who are not local citizens are there in Singapore because they have a work permit, like this case. Well, Singapore said, you are a work permit holder, you cannot come back due to the restrictions that we have in place to curb COVID. So he found himself stranded outside of the place where he lives with his wife in Singapore, his business in Singapore, his everything, his life in Singapore, not allowed to go back. So he spent some time in his home country, but he was fearing, rightly so, that if he spent too much time in that country, he would be liable to pay taxes there, because that country works like the jurisdictions that I mentioned before, type probably number one of the three types of jurisdictions that I mentioned. So if you stay there and if other elements are there, for instance, if you run a business from that country, you could be considered liable to pay taxes, even if you don't spend more than 6 months in the country. This is very important because some people say, well, I don't spend most of the year, so I spend less than 6 months in that jurisdiction, I'm not liable. No, you may still be liable. For instance, if you do business from there. So yes, we found solutions for that. Precisely because of COVID, other jurisdictions which are indeed tax friendly, like the United Arab Emirates, Antigua and Barbuda, even Bali, which is part of Indonesia, they've introduced so-called digital nomad visas, whereby, understanding that there are people who are stranded because of COVID, that bring wealth because they're generally relatively wealthy. They have to make a certain amount of money, which is usually $5,000 a month, which is not exactly low for most countries in the world. They say, okay, you can come to our jurisdiction and you will not be liable to pay taxes. Now, the United Arab Emirates do not charge any taxes in general. It's a tax-free jurisdiction. Other jurisdictions Indonesia is a country where you indeed pay taxes. but they have introduced these special rules for people, digital nomad visas, that can work from all over the world. They have an income from another country. They can prove that they have this income. They meet other criteria, criminal record, blah, blah, blah. And they can stay there for up to 1 year, and then they can renew this type of visa. So this is a concrete example that I can give.
And tell us, please, Federico, your experience is that because you say you are not a tax lawyer and you mostly deal with the contractual part of these transactions, of business setup and all that. So is your experience that lawyers work as teams, so that there is someone on the team that specializes in taxes? Or do you advise the double check on a firm that would cover all those needs? And that would be the first part of the question. The second would be, I am familiar with the thing that is called the double taxation treaties. And I understand that a lot of people really try to ensure how they will be paying their taxes on these double taxation treaties. Actually, this is the avoidance of double taxation, to be honest. And tell me what sort of experience you have with that.
Okay. First question, I tend to have a holistic approach to every legal task that I am entrusted with. So I do have some rudiments of tax law. Of course, I'm not, as I said before, I'm not a US lawyer, not a US tax lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. So in the jurisdictions where we don't have offices, of course, we need to rely on local experts. In the jurisdictions where we do operate, we do have people in our teams that that are versed with taxation aspects. So that is not so much of a problem. And yes, I would strongly advise to run checks before kicking off operations. Again, basing a whole life, personal life, that entails culture, beauty, schooling, language, internet connection, time zone, and so much more, only on how much taxes you pay is, I think, not worth doing. There are so many aspects to include in a life to plan that I personally wouldn't do. I wouldn't choose a jurisdiction simply because taxes are low. I would choose it because it's safe, because it's well connected, and so many other things. The same with the business. So is your business operating in a tax-friendly country where there is no rule of law? Well, I don't particularly like it. So I would check all these aspects in a holistic way, as I mentioned. As for double taxation agreements, the first thing that I check is that they're properly written, because sometimes they're not even clear to me and to many others. They're poorly drafted, and it is a matter of definitions. So what double taxation treaties do is usually to define what is an income, how it is taxed, and what rules apply when that specific income is taxed in country A, but you live in country B, or you do business in country B, because that's the whole point, not to be taxed twice. But for instance, there are countries like Vietnam where the definition of income is very broad. There is, you know, that in many other jurisdictions, you have a difference between, I don't know, dividends, capital gains, employment income deriving from rents, and so on. In Vietnam, this definition is much more blurred. It's all income, and it goes in the same pot, where it's taxed at the same level. So according to the same rates, which is not exactly what happens in other jurisdictions. So for instance, you're in Singapore, you have zero taxes on dividends, but then you are in Vietnam and those dividends are considered income. How do you go around that? And that is probably something that we can give a legal opinion on.
Sure. Federico, just a couple minutes left. Could you speak a little bit to the whole conflict resolution aspect, right? How do you, when you're advising one client on a properly written agreement for their business, how do you ensure that they're going to not have conflict with the other side? Or do you ever get involved in the middle of a couple different sides? I know you're not a mediator per se, but how do you help people avoid conflict in their business agreements?
In this case, it is fundamental to avoid it from the start, from the very beginning. because because even though a contract is between two private parties or more private parties, usually the conflict when it comes to taxation has to do with the state. So you fight against the tax authorities. And the fight is that the tax authorities claim that you owe the money and you have to demonstrate to the tax authorities that you don't own the money. So it's all a matter of evidence. It's evidence-based. And so my advice is to have, again, properly drafted agreements. We go back to episode 1, where all the elements are in place. And in this case, not just contracts, but also where you structure your business, where you run it from, where the servers are, what telephone numbers you use, what credit cards you use, what, I don't know, what subscriptions you have, where you go to the gym, so many other aspects that can prove that effectively you are paying taxes in jurisdiction A and you don't have to pay taxes in jurisdiction B. So if the tax authorities of jurisdiction B claim that you need to pay taxes in jurisdiction B, you can say, no, I have evidence which is strong enough to prove that I don't have to pay taxes here. But you need to build that evidence. And again, it is the strength of the truth.
And by saying that, Federico, you showed us and our viewers how complicated it can get and to which detail everything needs to be confirmed before any operation begins and before the contract is concluded. It's not the time to think about what taxes will apply once you already signed the contract. There are ways to put it the proper way so that everybody knows what to expect. And I do believe that this world of taxation in business is like a separate world. And I know that there are a lot of firms that specialize precisely in taxation, but I like your global approach a lot. And I think that everybody interested can just follow our series to know more about taxation, business, and global business in 20 minutes with you. See you in the next episode.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Mac.
Bye-bye.
Bye.